This is not coffee, this is just hot water, so everybody knows. Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see all of you. It's good to be here in Medina with all of you who have opted to brave the warm winter's majesty, and hopefully we had all safe travels. And I think everybody's covered the demographics of those who are watching today from downstairs to up here. To those of you who are on the webcast, we welcome all of you to the Medina, Ohio congregation presentation today. If you please make your way over with me, if you would please, as I begin to start this introduction of my sermon today. Most of you will know, and some of you may not know, but I've been doing this sermon series on defining what does the perfect church look like. Because I think in all of our minds that church looks a little bit different to all of us, especially when we're looking for maybe some programs. And by the way, I'm so glad, and I think we're so blessed to hear that Sabbath school has started up again. Sometimes, brethren, things just take patience, don't they? And I'll cover that just a little bit. This is not the main topic of what I wanted to cover today. But is there a perfect church? I'll start off with that question I've asked a couple times before. This is part 3 of maybe part 3, maybe part 4. I'm not quite sure yet. We'll see how this unravels, because Bill had brought up some things in his announcements that I think fits into the topic today, because I want to start to get into this thing called truth. Truth, how important is it? As we look for the perfect church, there are some components that we have in place oftentimes, and some components we don't have in place that maybe we should or can at the time. It takes some time to develop, and it's important upon us to really think about what the perfect church looks like and what those important components are that really make up the perfect church, because everybody's searching, aren't they? Most people are. They're searching for something, whether or not it's Christianity. Some people are looking for spiritual answers in different corners of different parts of different religions that don't quite answer the questions. A lot of the religions claim to be the way to the light, but never claim to be the light. So there's all these different things that add confusion to the search that people go through as they're trying to better themselves, better their lives, to try to become better people. What's important? What's important in church? So by way of reminder, Acts chapter 2, if you would please. And because this is a sermon series, and I don't know about you, but I like doing sermon series. I like them. I like doing them because it gives people a storyline to follow. And oftentimes there are pieces of the puzzle that don't get to be thrown into one sermon, and you find yourself trying to blitz your way through it, where in a sermon series you can kind of take your time and hit different aspects that are more important to other people, because we all prioritize what's important, don't we? And therefore we get a broader perspective of what the perfect church looks like, or what it should look like, instead of just having like a 45 or 50 to 60 minute to 90 minute sermons. And I have to admit, my sermon is going to be a little bit short today. I was a little bit surprised. And actually, when I stood up here first thing this morning, I kind of come up here and get my notes organized, and I was wondering when it was going to happen. The only thing that surprises me, I don't know why it didn't happen sooner or it hasn't happened more, was I stood up here. I'll give Darren credit. Darren was up there, and he said, "Hey, Tony, you mind telling me what happened last Sunday?" I'm going, "Last Sunday? What was last Sunday? What was last Sunday?" Maybe it's my selective memory, but I thought, oh, you want to go there today, do you? Yeah. So I had about 10 minutes of Cleveland Browns jokes because I anticipated an uncertain future. I thought for sure the Pittsburgh Steelers were going to win, and so now my sermon's about 10 minutes shorter. So don't thank me, thank the Cleveland Browns, because they saved you from what was about to be a lot of comedic blast towards the Cleveland Browns, and now I have to shut up for 10 minutes. Can't say what I wanted to say, but it is what it is. One of the basic things when you consider what is the perfect church is how do you define what the church is? There are a lot of misconceptions out there. A lot of people think that the Catholic Church is the church. Right? Everybody thinks that their church is the church, the Baptist church, and I've actually lost track of how many different types of Christian churches there are out there. And I've visited some very weird churches in my lifetime, brethren, because oftentimes we find ourselves, as Bill's talked about, oftentimes we're nomadic, aren't we? We're trying to find a place to meet. We have to rent places. We got to go to different places. And we met in this, I wish I could remember what the name of it was. Angie probably knows it. I don't know. Oh, what was it called? It was some sort of a Unitarian church. I didn't really know what that meant, and I'm not going to slander any other Unitarian church that may not be associated with this. But as we rented this little Unitarian church, I started reading in their ledger. You know, they have these sign-up logs. You know, so-and-so is here. Here's my phone number. And they had this little special little place that said, "What do you believe?" And they have, of course, put a little excerpt in there about what they believed about God and things like this. And I kid you not, one person actually wrote in there that they believed that the colony of ants around the world were God. Or the bees were God. They were looking towards something towards nature to describe what God was and what the church should look like. It was the most bizarre thing that I have ever read. And then you look around what's going on in the world today. I don't know about you, but I'm about Christmased out. You know, people sing about this Christmas spirit, and they talk about the Christmas spirit, and I'm glad I'm through all that, because believe it or not, there is a spirit out there during Christmas time, but it's not the jolly type oftentimes that you expect to see with candy canes and all that kind of stuff. People are kind of mean out there, if you will. We had to go to the grocery store on Christmas Eve. Oh my gosh, I don't want to do this. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to do everything I can not to do it again. But I think the important aspect of church is that, number one, we define what the church is, and number two, one of the most important components of the church and what it should be to the perfect church, don't you think that truth ought to have a component in that? And it's saying what the perfect church looks like. You don't come to church to hear lies. You don't come to church to hear my wrong philosophies on life. You don't come to church to be duped or be deceived and things like that. But in order to define the church, oftentimes we have to correct some misunderstandings, because oftentimes when you ask people, what church do you go to? Oh, my church is right down the road down there. Oh, my church is in that building over there. And we get this concept that the church is a building. And I talked about last time how the church building we hear is very lovely and very pretty, but that's not the church. And over here in Acts chapter 2, just by way of reminder, because when you do sermon series, brethren, you have to have a little bit of overlap, because there's some people that didn't hear part 2 that need to be brought up to speed before we can get into part 3, so that it necessitates a little bit of overlap. And here we have Luke. Remember, Luke was a very prolific person in the New Testament. In fact, he was the church, what I consider the church historian. You know, he set out to make a more accurate account of the things that had happened. So when Luke speaks about things, I tend to listen very, very closely, when it comes to the historical aspect. But what did the early church consider the church to be? Just to kind of dismiss what some people think a church is. It's not a building. But over here in verse 45 of Acts chapter 2, I talked about this thing called all things in common, where people give all their possessions away, and that, of course, have been exploited over the years by some church groups. I believe there is one fella in the Church of God movement, I can't remember who it is right now, who has all things in common, have even encouraged people to sell everything that they have and give to the church, second mortgages, and if you're married to somebody and they're on the mortgage, just simply take out half of your mortgage and send it to the church. It's all things in common. So this all things in common thing had its place in the New Testament church in the first century, but over the years has been greatly abused by a lot of people. But here's what people think, and Luke draws a very important distinction here between what the church is and what it isn't. In verse 43 rather, let's go there. Then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. Now all who believed were gathered together and had all things in common. I won't belabor that point anymore. I think I've done that enough. And sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. So the church is not a building. The church is, in fact, the people who are in the building. The building is just something that we utilize to come together, to fellowship, to break bread, to hear the sermons, to congregate. And as we've said many, many times before, church really is a laboratory if you think about it. It's a laboratory. It's a laboratory on how to get along with each other, how to become better people, to be instructed, to be corrected, to contemplate some of the important things in life. And we talked a little bit last time. I don't know if you've thought about this since I spoke last time, but some of our church experiences of the past. I'm not going to do it again today, but I took a little bit of a raise of hands to see who belonged to different churches, of different organizations, of different belief systems. And I think if we all would have a potluck, or let's do it this way, if we all had maybe like a fireside chat. I used to do this at the feast, where we'd have a little bit of a fireside chat, and we'd share our stories. I think we'd all have a lot of stories to share about why we're here and why we appreciate being here, because of the things that we came out of, we didn't want to be a part of. They were disappointing. And so I extrapolated some of my church experiences with a Southern Baptist wife, or a girlfriend at the time, who I hoped to marry. And driving down the road, she told me to go to hell, if you remember that. And that hasn't changed for 31 years of marriage. She still says it. A different context. But my church experience wasn't very good, being more of an atheistic thought, because my dad was a staunch atheist. I could tell you stories about him, and I could talk 2 hours on some of the things he used to tell me about God and some of the falsehoods about Christianity, about how it's only the weak people who come to Christianity. It's only the cowards who come to Christianity. Christianity is illogical. And some of the debates that people bring to the surface and the questions they ask you, you just simply can't answer. I think I mentioned the example last time. My dad said something along the lines of, hey, if God's so all-knowing and all-powerful and He can do anything, can God create a rock so big and heavy that even He can't move it? How do you answer something like that? My question is, Dad, why would He do that? Why would He do that? Then I talked about the one thing that was missing. Angie took me to her Southern Baptist church. The pastor gave the same message every single time. The message centered around the altar call. It was a 15-minute homily, not even a sermon. It was about repenting and turning to God, or you're all going to hell. If you want to be saved, just come up here and touch my hand. And I sat there and I watched all this. I became discouraged because I thought, here I am. I'm looking for the answers to the problems of the world. I'm looking for my place in this universe. At that time, I was doing it basically to please my girlfriend at the time, Angie. And I thought, I'm not getting any answers here. This is the same old thing over and over and over. There simply is no substance. Well, they had all the groups they wanted to. They had their preschools. They had their vacation Bible schools, which I sent my kids to one time. I think it was, remember, what was that, about the 1990s? In which they took these little amulets, these little crosses, dangled them in front of our kids' faces. I didn't want them to go. That was another point of controversy, but they did. If you just accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you can have this little shiny amulet. So I pulled them out of that. They didn't go back to that. And some of the things that were taught there, if you just come up and touch my hand, you'll have salvation. I talked about some of the gimmicks that were there. One guy pulled up in a Harley Davidson, rolled up. It was all a gimmick, and said, Jesus told me if I came here today that I would find the Lord. It was all a gimmick. I couldn't believe people couldn't see through it. And there were youth groups. There was a youth group with little oversight. Angie wasn't a part of that youth group, but as I was introduced to this youth group, when Angie told me to go to hell, I remember saying to her, well, if I'm going to hell, I certainly won't be alone. Because of the things that were going on in the youth group. So programs have their place, just like the Sabbath school coming back. I'm glad to see that. But the one thing I think people are expecting to find when they come to church, I hope you would agree with this, is at least a microcosm or at least a little speck of some truth. What's life about? What are we here for? What's my place in the universe? And what people fail to ask oftentimes until the last moments is, what happens when I die? Nobody hardly ever asks that question until you're up at the precipice facing the reality that here I am, whatever age I am, whether I'm in my 20s, 30s, or, man, I saw this sweet little girl on YouTube the other day. I think her name was Maisie. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I'll start to tear up, but she's going through cancer treatments. It was a St. Jude's commercial. This time St. Jude's just pulls my heartstrings on all the advertisements. Little Maisie. Maisie was going through the list of what her mom was telling her. What are you, Maisie? I'm kind. I'm loving, I'm brave, and I'll shut up at that. But anyways, it just tugs my heartstrings too much. And there's a lot of people, a lot of questions out there. And there's a lot of answered questions that aren't answered in quite the right fashion. There's a lot of disinformation out there. So I would submit to you that as we are a church, the one thing that people are expecting to hear is the truth, the gospel. What's going on in the world? What happens next? Where are we in these end times? You know, because remember, John, I think it was either the first or second chapter of that John series, you remember even in the first century, John even said, brethren, it is the last hour. You remember that statement that he made? Referring to the end times? Well, brethren, that was 2,000 years ago. So if they were in the last hour 2,000 years ago, where are we now? Last 5 minutes? 30 seconds? That's a question that I cannot answer. I don't know the answer to that question, but I know I'm watching. I'm watching these current events. There are changes going on in the world. Bill, I just mentioned, what's his name, Monduro? Was his name Monduro down there? How he was extradited from his throne down there in South America. When I saw the news report this morning, like Bill said, it looked to be more of a law enforcement extraction that was supported by Delta Force. I don't know if you know what Delta Force is, but man, you do not want to find yourself on the wrong end of Delta Force. I mean, these are some bad hombres. Bad hombres. They are absolutely the best in the world at what they do. There's none that compare. You talk about the Navy SEALs, you can talk about the Green Berets and the Rangers, and they all have their place. But when you talk about Delta Force, man, you are on a different level. These are bad hombres. And when they send those guys in, you might as well just go ahead and cuff yourself because you're done. You're going out one way or the other. And that's just the way it is. We talk about the threats in Russia and the things that are going on. We need to be able to answer some of these questions. So I would submit to you for your consideration that truth is one of the most vital components that you can have when you're looking for a church. Truth matters. In fact, over here in John chapter 14, if you turn over there with me, John chapter 14, Jesus even refers to himself as the truth, the incarnate word, the truth. So the words of Jesus oftentimes, always express that truth. Unfortunately, when people read the words of Christ, they're very, very selective on what they want to hear. I can remember, Bill, you might remember this. Angie, I know you remember it because we talked about it. But several years ago, I did a Armor of God presentation, and I did a sermon presentation on red letter theology. And when I gave the announcement of what I was going to be talking about, people went, is he going to talk negative about red letter? You know what red letter theology is, don't you? Red letter theology, if you look in your Bible oftentimes, not every transliteration has this, but when Jesus Christ speaks, his words are documented and labeled appropriately in my Bible by letters in red. Okay? And when you're out there in the world of webcasting and YouTube and you're listening to all these people present their information about what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what you can do, what you shouldn't do, what God expects, what he doesn't expect, oftentimes they will retort to you, point to me a scripture about homosexuality that are in red letters. Or whatever. There are some, by the way. I'm not going to go there today. But if Jesus didn't say it, and if it's not in the red letters, you can't hold it as a doctrine. The problem is, and I'll get to this here in just a minute, people don't know who Christ is. They can mark all the letters in red in the New Testament they want to, but there are plenty of things that he said in the Old Testament that aren't in letters of red that compose the entirety of truth in God's Word, which is the Old Testament and the New Testament. And oftentimes when people go to church, they're only getting the New Testament, which, okay, in and of itself, it's a good thing. But you can't understand the New Testament without the Old. You can't understand the Old without the New. That's just the way it goes. And now we break into the context here, something we go over at least I do, every Passover, in John chapter 14. And he says in verse 1, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. if it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. So one of the vital truths of Christianity is, what happens when you die? Where are we going? Places of administration, places of power, places of authority. When most people, and I'm not criticizing, I'm just telling you what people believe because you've experienced it yourself, they find themselves thinking about this beatific vision where all they can picture to you or extrapolate to you is that they're going to be staring God in the face for eternity. The Bible is much more in depth than that. The truth is much more in depth than that. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may also be. Where's he going, brethren? Are we going to heaven? Where's Jesus Christ going? Where's he gathering us to? Do you remember? Earth. Specifically the Mount of Olives. That's a component of truth that people oftentimes don't get. And where I go, you know, and the way you know. And Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going, and how can we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And this has been one of the most eye-opening parts of Christ's ministry that has always attracted me to Christianity. What did Buddha claim? I know the way to the light. He never claimed to be the light, though, did he? There are people that claim to know the way to this thing called nirvana, this spiritualized religion, this man-made religion. But Jesus is the only one that claimed to be the way. He is the only one in world history who has been deified, if you want to put it that way, who has ever claimed not to just know the way, but to be the way. And that is one thing that separates Christianity from every other religion that you ever come across, that he claimed to it. You know what else is interesting in this? When you look at the syntax of how he laid this out in the scriptures, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Anybody ever done a study of the old tabernacle and the temple? The outer court, before you went in, guess what it was known as? The way. You go into the next door. You know what it was known as? The truth. And when you went into the Holy of Holies, you know what that was considered? Life. All these biblical tapestries from the Old Testament to the New point to one thing: the truth of who Jesus Christ is and who we are in relationship to him and what his plan is for everybody. And without that component called truth, that's why you get all these different ideas that are commingled with the vain imaginations of men. Going to heaven is a vain imagination of men. Immortality of the soul is the vain imagination of men that was propelled not by men primarily, but by who, brethren? Satan. It was the first lie he ever told. It was the first lie that was ever believed. Did God really say that? Hey, Eve, I'm not so sure you understood him correctly. Are you sure you heard him right? Has he really said you'll die? No, here's what he really meant. So if we're not engaged in the truth, brethren, it's easy to be duped by anything. It's easy to be duped by anything that people bring to us. Over here in John chapter 4, I'm going to be reading from John here just a little bit. John chapter 4. And over here in 17. Most of you will remember this story about the Samaritan woman at the well, the controversy of who were the real Jews, the Samaritans, or the Jews of his time, God's original people, I guess you could put it that way. In this discourse, it was not lawful for somebody to have a conversation with the Samaritan. Here Jesus finds himself thirsty at this well, engaged with this Samaritan woman, and we break into this in verse 16, and Jesus says, go call your husband and come here. Notice what he's looking for. What is he looking for from this woman? Notice what he's looking for in us, what he's trying to develop in us. There's an underlying moral story to this engagement that he has with this Samaritan, and it's important that we remember that. Truth is important to God. And where we fall on that spectrum of truth matters to God. Where do we get our truth from? Society? Whew, look out. Be careful. Where do we get it from the Bible? The woman answered and said, I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, you have well said, I have no husband. He has an appreciation for our truthful response. No matter how bad the truthful response is, he appreciates the truthful engagement here. For you have had 5 husbands, and the other one whom you now have is not your husband, in that you spoke truly. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worship on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. And Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. Wow. What a statement. There are people out there with all these different worship ideas, all these different ideologies, and they think they're right, but they just don't quite get it. Now, I'm not saying I have it all right, because I certainly don't. Am I saying the Church of God culture has it all right? I think there's going to be some surprises in the end. The Bible is not all revealing. He reveals about this much of what we need to know to give us the hope living in this world to help us make it through all this that's going on. It's very interesting. You worship what you do not know. We know that we worship for salvation is of the Jews, but the hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in what, brethren? Truth. And the Father is seeking such that worship Him according to their ideology. Does it say that? That seek to worship Him in spirit and in truth. We're just now coming out of a season. I just brought that up when I started speaking up here about Christmas. And I've watched some of my most respective, how do I put this? I think you call them YouTube influencers. There's some pretty brave people out there that aren't of this fold, that are Sunday keepers and such the like, and you see them out there and they're street preachers. Non-assuming, non-threatening, but they're out there, they're bold, they're preaching the gospel as they know it. And some of the most disappointing statements that I have seen made this year, by the way, I give them credit for doing that. I've never done that. That's got to be a hard thing to do out in this society. I've seen them be spit on. I've seen them have things thrown at them. I've even seen them be cussed out. You name it. It runs the gamut. Violence are against them. And I can't remember his name. I know most of these people by their faces. I don't know them by their names. There's just too many of them. But he sat there, I think it was his son. He didn't say it was his son, but they had the same facial features, so he must have been a relative of some kind during the Christmas season. And he sat across from looked like I'm trying to think what they call themselves, Afro-Israelites? Black Hebrew, yeah, there you go. Black Hebrewites, or whatever they call themselves. And he took this preacher to task. He said, you call yourself a Christian, but God says you shouldn't eat pork. What do? Oh, I ate pork because God said I could eat it. Where does it say that at? Oh, well, it says it here in Mark. No, that's not what it says. He took this guy, who I have a lot of respect for, to task, and he had no answer. And he decided to take them to task on something they did, and this other guy retorted back to this YouTube influencer, do you put up a Christmas tree? Well, absolutely I put up a Christmas tree. It's Christmas. And he said, do you even know what you worship? Do you even know who you worship? Let alone what you worship? You put up a Christmas tree when God says in Jeremiah 10, you ought not do that. And I watched it unfold. I watched the train wreck. I had sitting there, I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. And as he tried to make every excuse and every appeal to this guy, why he does what he does, and his son joined in on the argument, it started to get a little bit loud, and they said, we don't worship the Christmas tree. And he said, why put it up? Then why put it up? Because God is searching for people who worships Him in spirit, in an ideology, or truth. I get the impression that when we go through all these debates about what God requires and what He's looking for and whom He's searching for to worship Him, the number one quality that He's looking for is people who are seeking the truth. And I would suspect that as Jesus Christ was represented in that tabernacle and later temple tapestry, as I told you about just a little bit, the way, the truth, and the life, I would imagine that he would expect that the truth be taught in his sanctuaries. Not not a fabrication of the truth, but the actual biblical truth. That's hard to do when you're not getting the Old Testament and the New Testament together. And over here, I'm going to take you over to, let's see, where do I want to go next? The things that people don't realize that they carry when we throw the truth to the side, or we don't keep the things that God wants us to, is over here in Isaiah 46, some of the downfalls of not preaching the truth. And as I get into this, let me ask you a question. It's a question I ask from time to time, because many times I'll get a retort from somebody. Why did you speak about that? Why did you talk about that topic? Why did you talk about the COVID-19 vaccination? Why did you talk about black robe regiments or some of these things? And I'll look at them and say, why can't I? Because ministers should never talk about things like that, especially things that are political. In fact, I got a phone call from somebody years ago. I'd mentioned something that was considered political. It wasn't political. And I had a nice conversation with this individual. They bothered to call me to work it out, like Matthew 18 actually says. And by the time I got done explaining to this person why I said what I said, they were perfectly okay with what I said. I just maybe didn't clarify myself a little bit or something like that. But in this conversation, she said, why did you even talk about that anyways? Ministers should never talk about that. My husband used to be a minister, and he said you should never talk about that. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'll make you a deal. I will never talk about that topic again. I will never bring it up again. I will never speak about it. I'll never allude to it. I'll leave it alone. I'll throw it away if you can do me just one thing. Yeah, sure. What's that? Let's do it. Scripture and verse, please. Huh? Yeah. If you can show me through Genesis through Revelation why I shouldn't have talked about that topic, I'll stop right now. And they said, good point. I apologize. So oftentimes, brethren, when we speak about the things that we do, as long as we're truthful, we're not making things up, we can substantiate what we're saying. The only thing that I ever see a minister what they shouldn't talk about in the Scriptures is something that someone tells me something in confidence. You know, hey, Tony, I got something to tell you, but don't tell anybody. You know what most people do when you tell them that? Guess what? It's like the exercise. I love the exercise that Jesus did when he was healing people. Remember when he said, now, listen, go your way. Go your way. You're healed. But do me a favor. Shh. Don't tell anybody. You know what happens when you tell somebody not to say something? It's the first thing they do. Hey, I got something to tell you. I think that was an exercise in human psychology that Jesus did on that time. Of course he wanted people to know. It's one thing that validated his ministry. But over here, I think people don't quite get it. Sometimes the trappings, especially the time of the Christmas season, these other things that are going on New Year's. New Year's is a vain imagination of men. This isn't the new year. God's new year doesn't start in the wintertime. When does it start? Abib, right? The month of Abib. So now you have these guys who are sitting in their positions of authority who think of themselves more highly than they ought to, inflated by their self-perception of false importance, and they start to name months after themselves. And they want to name New Year's and this and that, but that's not God's New Year. That's not God's truth. That's a fabrication. It's completely a fabrication, but sometimes people don't understand that we're engaging ourselves in something called, there's two primary things that we engage ourselves in when we go the way we throw truth to the side. And sometimes that's a hard pill to swallow when you realize, why did I do that? What prompted me to do that? What prompts me to believe that? The two things that people engage themselves are covetousness and idolatry. And all those things have consequences to them. And over here in Isaiah chapter 46, one of my favorite scriptures on some of the things that people carry along with themselves when they're worshiping God is found right here. We have no idea the burdens that we put on ourselves and the limitations we put on ourselves and discovery of this thing called truth when we embrace things that we just take for granted and don't question. I never questioned Christmas. The time I started to question Christmas was when Angie and I were engaged in those me going to hell conversations. And I went over to my buddy Scott's house. A lot of you people have seen Scott or known Scott. He's been at the Feast of Tabernacles. He's a member of the Columbus, Ohio congregation. And we would start to watch, what was Garner Ted Armstrong's old show? Was it Tomorrow's World? Bill, what was that? The World Tomorrow. Tomorrow's World was something, was a different program, I think. But we'd sit there and watch these things, and then Scott would give me a pamphlet. And one of the things he gave me was Christmas. And I don't know about you, but the first time I was confronted with the truth, it didn't promote within me anything that would want me to kick back and say, hey, I'm going to plug my ears. I've actually had people say that to me before. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I've had family members ask me questions. Hey, Tony, tell me again, why can't we do Christmas and stuff like that? And I'll start to go into my monologue, and they'll go, oh, hold on. Shut up, don't say any more. Why? You asked me to tell you why. Because I know you're probably right, and then once I hear it, I'm responsible for it, so I just don't want to hear it. Now, I think your experience was probably much like mine, very similar, in that when you had your assumptions challenged, when you bothered to look into things, when my buddy Scott handed me that pamphlet, I had such an excitement, and my excitement, once I expressed it, it wasn't quite returned the way that I hoped it would. You ever notice that? Like, oh boy, check this out. I don't have to go to 4 different family gatherings this year. I don't have to do that. Oh man, it was a relief to me. Angie and I we were running like crazy people. And then you tell people and you think they're going to have the same responsive refreshing. Oh man, that was such a relief. I don't have to do this anymore. And other people have the expression, they get mad. They get mad. It's amazing. Oftentimes I think our first introduction to having our assumptions challenged, I can remember that. God talks about returning to your first love. And every time I think about returning to the first love, I think about that moment when you heard that topic, whatever it was, expressed in a way, in an opposite way that you never considered. And all of a sudden, boom! Those lights come on, and we never look back. We never look back. What should it go back to? Dean Martin? Singing Christmas is for Kids? You ever listen to the radio during this time of year? Like Dean Martin sounds like half man, half billy goat anyways. You ever heard him sing? Snowflakes, peppermints, canes. Like, I got to get out of this. And when you realize that's all a fabrication, it's all made up. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, Santa Claus is his own different category. But all that stuff was promoted by big business. And I've often wondered what would happen if we never had such a thing as movie pictures and news media and department stores. I wonder how much Christmas really would have caught on. It was promoted by big business. But I think what people fail to realize is the relief that the truth should give us, and not only receiving the truth, but preaching it and living it and expressing it to other people, is that, my goodness, it is liberating. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall do what, brethren? The truth is liberating. I don't know about you, but I feel liberated. And the pressures that are on our shoulders to conform to society, confirmations and things like that. But here's what happens when we enter ourselves into idolatry and covetousness and we forget about the truth or we don't seek the truth. Baal bows down and Nebo stoops in verse 1. Their idols were on the beast and on the cattle. Your carriages were heavy loaded. A burden to the weary beast, they stooped down, they bowed down together, but they could not deliver the burden. Too much to carry. Lies are too much to carry. You ever notice that? My dad always told me that if you tell the truth, you never have to remember what you said. You ever notice why most people get caught in lies? Because they forget what they said previously. And now they have to make something completely else up differently to support why they didn't say what they said before. And when simply, if you just tell the truth, guess what? It's pretty liberating. If there's one thing that God can work with, and I've always told my family this, God works with is the truth no matter what you've done. I've always told my kids, I don't care what you've done. I don't care. You might have consequences for what you've done, but if you tell me the truth, I've got something I can work with. I can work with the truth. I don't care how bad the information is. I don't care it is what you've done. You're going to have to go through whatever you got to go through because you did what you did. But if you tell me the truth, I'm more than willing to help you through this. But if you're going to lie to me, man, there's no help in that. In fact, if you lie to me, there's no relationship there. If you're not transparent with me, you don't have to tell me every little detail. That's not what I'm saying. But all I'm saying is eyeball to eyeball. Dad to kid, or kid to dad, or husband to wife, or friend to friend, or man to God, whatever it is, eyeball to eyeball, what really matters is when you're honest. Because that's how I know people, and that's how God knows us. You'll see many times where people admit in the Scriptures the things that they've done. Look at David. David's going to be a high-ranking official in the kingdom of God when Jesus Christ returns. David was far from imperfect. He liked war eventually. Remember the story about I won't get lewd, but the foreskins and all that? And God basically said, man, golly gee willikers, David, you come to like blood. It's enough. It's enough. But what God appreciated about David was he was honest. I sinned. But I digress. The truth tends to bog us down, and that's what Isaiah is getting across here. He says, listen to me, O house of Jacob, and the remnant of the house of Israel who have been upheld by me from birth, who have been carried from the womb, even to your old age, I am he, even to gray hairs, I will carry you. I have made and I will bear, even I will carry you and deliver you. To whom will you liken me and make me equal and compare me that we should be alike? I had an old friend years ago. He worked with me at the sheriff's office. I don't even know if he's still alive. But he and his dad, his dad was a lieutenant, Lieutenant Boyd at the sheriff's office. His son, Mark, I can't remember the other, Jerry Boyd. And I don't think Mark's around anymore. He was in pretty bad health. But Lieutenant Boyd and Mark were pastors. It was kind of neat because I didn't know they knew all my football coaches. And when they asked me to come to church, all my football coaches were there. It was like a nice reunion. But Mark and I would always have this little debate about paganism versus Christianity. That was the time of my arrogance in my walk with Christ when I was first exposed to this, because the truth can do that to you. Truth can become a time where you enjoy the intellectual argument, but it produces no fruit, and you just like to argue. That's how mine started. And so Mark invited me to church one day, and to my chagrin, we had just been talking about Easter. I was talking about the days of unleavened bread. He was talking about Easter. And he said, why are you so caught up in this paganistic aspect anyways? It all belongs to God. There's many paths to Christ. Really. So he stood up there and he gave this sermon about seeing Jesus through the Easter bunny. Wow. He said, what's wrong with likening God to the Easter bunny? Bunnies are kind of cute, aren't they? This is a sermon. Yeah, but Christ is no bunny. He said, bunnies are fluffy and white, not the ones by my house. They're gray and look like they got mange. That's what my bunny rabbits look like at my house. But they got these great big ears. And those ears are to hear the prayers of the saints. He's got a nice big fluffy tail. I couldn't remember what the tail was for. And he had bunny rabbits have these great big feet so he can run swiftly to answer your prayers. I'm going, you got to be kidding me. Where's the truth in that? What was that promoting in me to change? What was that all about? You see, people can justify anything that they want to justify by looking at things from a humanistic point of view. I think we've all done that from time to time in our lives, but I think truth is important. The frustrating thing, brethren, over here in John chapter 18 that we run into, John chapter 18, I'm sure you've heard this amongst your circles every now and then. I've heard it. I have heard this response ad nauseum in my ministry, ad nauseum when I'm talking to people. In verse 31, we'll go over there. Now, do I want to go there? Let's see here. It'd help if I get on the right scripture here. What did I say? John chapter 18. John chapter 18. Here we go. You remember this most famous engagement with Jesus and Pontius Pilate. This shows the humanistic side of things, the way we kind of justify human beings, that is, how and what and why and where we worship God, irrespective to how the way that He says we should, because that's the bottom line. Do you believe there's a God, brethren? Do we believe there's a God? Do we not believe that it's His prerogative to explain to us how, what, why, and where, and who we worship? He's God. He does. He's the Almighty. He does reserve that right for Himself, and oftentimes people take that prerogative upon themselves and tell God why they're going to worship Him the way that they choose to. That may not be the sentiment in their expression, but that's really what's behind it. That's really what we're saying in the end of it all. In verse 31 it says, Then Pilate said to them, You take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. I think they were lying to themselves, weren't they? It's okay for you to do it, but we can't do it. Isn't that called hypocrisy? A little hypocrisy there. That the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, Are you the king of the Jews? Now you're facing death. You're facing the death sentence. Now obviously he has a different perspective because that's why he came into the world. But you put me in this situation, I don't know what I'm going to say. I'm the king of the Jews? Wait a minute, isn't death the penalty for that? Yeah, well, let me think about that. I'll get back to you, Pilate. I'll get back to you. And Jesus said, Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? I won't digress on that, but that's a very interesting statement right there that he makes in and of itself. I won't go into that, but Pilate answered and said, I am a Jew, or am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priest have delivered you to me. What have you done? Time to tell up, time to tell the truth. And Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here. And Pilate therefore said to him, Are you a king then? Maybe. Maybe could I get a life sentence instead of the death penalty? You start to negotiate. Isn't that what we do when we're faced with, we start to negotiate a little bit? So Jesus is faced with this situation. He goes the way of the truth because he is the truth. Are you a king then? And Jesus answered, You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. It was his whole mission. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. That's why you keep the days of unleavened bread. That's why you keep the Passover. That's why you don't do Christmas. That's why you don't celebrate Easter. Because you hear the voice of the shepherd, which is predicated on telling you the truth. And in response, what does he want? Us to respond in such a manner to the truth. When God calls us, there is a response that he expects, and the truth. And then the most disappointing thing that you hear from people is this, and Pilate said to him, What's truth? You ever heard somebody retort to you that way? What's truth? Your truth isn't always my truth, and my truth isn't always your truth. You see, there's a difference between perception and reality. Oftentimes, people live the truth according to their perception of things. And perception can be the truth sometimes, but oftentimes perception is not the truth. Perception is simply based on life experiences. We grew up keeping these things, Christmas and Easter, and to us that was our perception, so therefore it became our truth. And until God challenged those assumptions, guess what? We did whatever we did. And oftentimes when you talk to people, they'll say, Well, I don't do it that way. I don't keep it with a religious component, just like that YouTube influencer. Well, I put up a Christmas tree, but I don't worship it. Really? Well, you might not bow down to it. You might not pray to it. But you erect it. You participate in it. And besides that, does it really matter what you think? What does it matter to God? That's the question people never ask themselves. If people would simply predicate on what they're about to do and celebrate on the question, what does God think about this? Doesn't matter what I think about this. I can stand up here all day and tell you my opinion about things. But quite frankly, God doesn't care about my opinion. It's already set in place. It's already been set in motion. The truth is the truth. The way is the way. There's no changing it, no matter what our perception is, because perception isn't always reality. The true reality is what God says is truth. That's the reality of it. That's the reality of what we're dealing with. What is truth? This subjectivism that's going on in the world. I'll tell you what, the things that people are taking the bait on nowadays. I don't want to get into too much of this, and I won't get into too much of this today, brethren, but man, what I just witnessed in New York, the swearing in of that mayor. I got to tell you, I wonder what people are thinking. What are people thinking? Do they not realize what they just voted into office by doing that? You see, the lie is this, amongst many, that there's nothing wrong with Islam. Islam is just another path to the truth. Have you ever studied Islam? Islam is not an option. It is not a God-ordained different version of the truth, and I don't care what the Quran says. I just watched a new candidate be sworn into office on the Quran. That's not made up. That's not me just saying speculative things. I watched it. It was reported. And if it turns out to be wrong, I will make an apology for it. But I don't think it's wrong. I watched what I watched. I heard what I heard. My eyes weren't deceiving me. And when we put someone into office who has values that are contrary to the truth and contrary to the culture of the United States of America, Katie, bar the door. Katie, bar the door, because here we go. Yeah, I was kind of chuckling a little bit. I was watching these ladies give their speeches. I can't pronounce his name, so I won't. But as he did his swearing in to the office, I watched these ladies come up and give their speeches, and I thought to myself, kind of chuckled, do they understand that they're going to be wearing burqas in a couple years? You know, the head coverings. Do you understand what they just engaged in? What they voted in? Islam is not a moral religion as it's presented. And I don't know if you realize this or not, because I've done a study on it. I did it years ago. You know, especially the brand of Islam that engages in Sharia law. You ever studied Sharia law? You know that there's a reason why. I don't want to go too much into this, but there's a reason why you'll see somewhat of that religious belief do a mass shooting or something like that. And it's no coincidence that the neighbors will say, he was such a nice boy. Carried in my groceries, cut my grass for me. You see, under Sharia law, you're allowed to lie for a while until it's time to spring the truth. Islam is violent. Islam isn't even a religion per se. It is a political movement with religious undertones that has the positioning of itself to overtake cultures and to force on them certain types of slavery and hold people under bondage. It is satanic to the core. For crying out loud, the founder of the religion, Muhammad married a 6-year-old and consummated the marriage when she was 9. And if you take to task a Muslim cleric on that, they will get violent. And if they don't get violent, you know what they'll do? They'll justify it. It is disgusting. It is immoral. It's a trap. And here we are as Americans, very, very quickly, not even going to mention, get into what's going on in Minnesota and Columbus, Ohio right now at these child daycares that aren't child daycares as they're driving their Maseratis and you're struggling. It is violent. It is to put people in in these metaphorical chains, if you will, and it is for a hostile takeover eventually. I make no apologies for saying that. I tell you, at a rapid rate in our country, we are throwing the principles of this Judeo-Christian document to the side and embracing lies. I even typed up in my little handheld computer there, what did the Founding Fathers say about Islam? And I couldn't find it this morning. I wanted to bring it to you. And AI, if I haven't said this here before, I'll say it today. I've said it in Columbus many times. Be careful with searching biblical issues on AI. I have found bogus, outright lies about Christianity. When AI gives me the return, it'll lead you down a path that you don't want to go down. But I'll tell you what, brethren, when we are dismissing the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of which, by the way, those principles, America, and I won't apologize for this either, America was founded upon, as imperfect as the Founding Fathers were, when you start to abandon the true Creator and you start to embrace things like Islam, you're in trouble. You are in trouble. You know not what you ask for, or could we say, you know not what you worship. It's all about inclusion and tolerance. The next day he came out and said something along the lines of, I know people don't like big government, but look out, here it comes. Socialism, Mohammedism. And when AI returned the reply that the Founding Fathers said nothing negative about someone who followed Muhammad as a political electee, that was a lie. There are plenty in there. I've got this Bible. I wish I could have found it this morning, called the Patriots American Bible. It has all these quotes of the Founding Fathers in and throughout Genesis to Revelation, what they thought about it. And in there is a warning about embracing Islam in our politics. And a lot of people, what they forget, because history tells the truth oftentimes, sometimes it doesn't, because often the victors rewrite history. But we forget why the United States Navy was even founded. Do you remember why the United States Navy came into existence? The Marines still sing about it. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Remember that? Because merchant ships were being taken, and those who followed Muhammad were taking people in as slaves, and therefore the United States Navy had to be born. The truth is found not only in the Bible, but is validated throughout with history. So Americans ought to be careful, and churches ought to be careful what it is they embrace. America has gone through a whole litany of lies through the last different decades that we've all been a part of. From my generation, the 1970s, I'll tell you what, I can almost bring it to an apex here with all the lies that were told during COVID. And I don't want to belabor that point at all, but there were plenty of lies that were told during COVID. And unfortunately, the truth wasn't allowed to be told, the other side of the story, and I'll get into this on my next sermon because I know I'm almost out of time, but when you censor the other side of the story, people cannot make the right decisions in their lives because they're being fed propaganda. There are a lot of things coming out now, brethren, they're coming to the surface, that at the times, if I would have said it from this lectern right here, it would have been shut down because I was lying. I was not lying. People were believing a lie. I was trying to counteract that lie. Because if people are going to make decisions in their lives, you know what you have to do? You have to give them the whole story, both sides, and let them sift it out for themselves. It's called critical thinking, for crying out loud. Propaganda. As it turns out now, I don't know if you've heard this one or not. I'm kind of waiting for this one to ferment a little bit more before I say it as fact. But it does seem to appear, remember that experimental, can I say vaccination now? We'll find out, I guess. Of that experimental vaccination that was rushed through emergency use. Do you remember that? You remember that? I was telling people every time I stood up here, go slow with that. I wasn't telling you not to do it. Go slow. Be sure you know what you're doing. As it turns out now, the narrative is being changed. Remember when they said that mRNA or those spike proteins would stay in your muscle. They don't. They don't. I have a sister-in-law who's a nurse. Right after she got that, she got breast cancer. It wasn't a DNA type because they did the DNA profile on it. She says, I wish I never would have got it. And while there are those going, get your shot, brethren, on their Facebook pages, they forgot they're dealing with people's lives. And the sheep need to hear both sides of the story for their 5 minutes of fame. And now it turns out that since that DNA, or that, what do you call it, the spike protein goes out, it's causing cancer in people, now it's turning out that the formula that was approved for emergency use, people didn't even get that. They got the different version that wasn't approved. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing when people don't stop to consider there might be another side to the story. Censorship doesn't work. It's a form of control. I think we've come through that. I think we've experienced enough with that we don't want to go down that path again. But truth, brethren, is absolute. Truth cannot be changed. I've said it before. I don't know if I've said it here or not. 2 plus 2 will always equal 8. It doesn't, does it? What does 2 plus 2 equal? 4. The only way that you can change that is lie to yourself. And by the way, that practice that example I just gave you, that's what's being taught in schools. That's one of the reasons why my wife is retiring. Oh, little Johnny, it doesn't matter how you came to the answer. It doesn't matter what answer you get. It doesn't matter that you arrive to the truth. What's important is we like to see how you worked out that. As long as you worked it out okay, it doesn't matter if you come to the truthful answer. It's getting old. It's getting really old. So, brethren, I think that as we go through this, have I got a little bit of time? I'm up? Okay. All right. I'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and close this. So there will be a part 4 to this. I haven't even gotten into some of the other stuff that I wanted to talk about, truth in church, but I think when you look at this, especially as you look back and you see the paths that we all took to get here, and now that we're here, I think the appreciation for the truth is really what we're here. Those other things, those other programs and things, those can be developed. There's ways to do that. There's time to do that. But for now, one of the main components of the perfect church is found in Jesus Christ and what He represented. And simply put, it's the truth.